Think ancient history was all wise philosophers and noble gladiators? Nope. Antiquity was absolutely packed with spectacular idiots who basically invented the Darwin Award in sandals. Quick legal disclaimer: do not attempt any of these historical life hacks. The laws of physics haven't changed in 2,000 years. Let's unearth the 10 dumbest ways the ancient world voluntarily deleted itself. 1. The glorious Roman Empire was famously built on two things: unparalleled military conquest and an absolute mastery of civic engineering. Their aqueducts were architectural marvels that practically played God with millions of gallons of fresh water, relying on a brilliant mix of gravity, stone, and sheer human willpower. But sometimes you hand the keys to a vital piece of infrastructure to a guy whose ego is vastly larger than his understanding of basic hydrodynamics. Meet Cassius, a mid-level maintenance supervisor stationed in a bustling provincial capital, who possessed the kind of toxic micromanagement skills that made his subordinates actively pray to Jupiter for a localized plague. The city's water supply relied on an inverted siphon, which is essentially a giant U-shaped lead pipe that uses gravity to violently force water down a steep valley and shoot it back up the other side to maintain the flow. One sweltering summer week, a catastrophic blockage of compacted branches and river mud formed at the absolute lowest, most aggressively pressurized point of the valley curve. When Cassius arrived at the access shaft, he found his crew of laborers flat out refusing to crawl inside the dark, claustrophobic, 2-foot-wide tube to clear the jam. Furious at their entirely reasonable fear of being pulverized by an underground tsunami, Cassius ripped off his toga, called them all pathetic cowards unworthy of the Republic, and declared he would just go down there and kick the damn thing loose himself. He treated the fundamental laws of physics like they were merely polite suggestions from a junior clerk. Cassius shimmied down into the pitch-black, suffocatingly tight pipe, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that millions of gallons of water were currently stacked up behind that dam of twigs, building a reservoir of kinetic potential energy equivalent to a modern ballistic missile. As his bare shoulders scraped against the slimy lead walls, he finally reached the tightly packed blockage, muttering arrogant curses about incompetent contractors and lazy slaves. Without a single moment of hesitation or a basic mental calculation regarding water pressure per square inch, Cassius drew his leg back in the cramped space and delivered a mighty, prideful kick directly into the structural center of the debris jam. The compacted mud immediately gave way, and the laws of fluid dynamics gleefully accepted his invitation to party. The blockage disintegrated in a fraction of a millisecond, unleashing the full, unadulterated fury of a backed-up Roman reservoir directly into the back of his skull. Cassius didn't even have time to register surprise before the crushing weight of the water instantly pulverized his skeleton, accelerating him to the speed of a wildly out-of-control bobsled. He rocketed through the pitch-black, curving pipe in a terrifying, high-velocity tidal wave of his own making, violently flushed up the ascending side of the valley siphon like a fleshy torpedo. He was ejected from the exit pipe high in the city limits, smacking face first into the solid granite wall of the main receiving reservoir. The city's water pressure was immediately and spectacularly restored, washing away his pulverized remains and proving once and for all that, while Rome wasn't built in a day, its engineers could certainly be demolished in about 4 seconds flat if they decided to punch a literal waterfall in the face. 2. There is a very specific type of unearned, highly radioactive confidence that belongs exclusively to 20-year-old apprentices who have read half of an instruction manual and suddenly believe they are smarter than the master architect. Take our next historical genius, an aggressively smug junior stonemason named Quintus, working on a massive triumphal arch in the center of a bustling Roman forum. Quintus was utterly obsessed with the concept of perfect friction, constantly bragging to the veteran builders that his stone-cutting skills were so flawlessly precise that his marble blocks practically fused together upon contact. He firmly believed that the time-tested methods of Roman engineering were just outdated crutches for untalented hacks who didn't understand true artistry. Now, a quick refresher on ancient physics. A classic stone arch relies entirely on gravity and compression to stay standing. The massive, wedge-shaped stones are completely useless and will immediately plummet to the earth until the final, central block, the keystone, is hammered into the absolute top center, locking the entire massive jigsaw puzzle into a state of permanent tension. Until that magic rock is securely placed, the whole multi-ton structure has to be carefully cradled by a heavy, elaborate wooden scaffolding framework called centering. One fateful afternoon, the master builder stepped away for a long lunch, leaving Quintus unsupervised on the upper scaffolding with a crew of terrified day laborers. Looking at the nearly finished arch, which was just missing its crucial central keystone, Quintus had a phenomenally idiotic epiphany. He decided this was his grand moment to prove his supreme genius to the entire city by presenting them with a freestanding, perfectly balanced arch held together by nothing but his flawless masonry skills. Grabbing a heavy iron sledgehammer, he cheerfully began smashing the wooden support struts, holding up the entire, incredibly precarious ton of hovering marble above his head. The older, vastly more experienced laborers screamed at him to stop, scrambling down the ladders in absolute panic. But Quintus just laughed them off, mocking their lack of visionary courage as he systematically destroyed the only thing preventing gravity from cashing in its checks. He wanted the grand reveal to be perfect, so he positioned himself directly dead center underneath the towering apex of the unfinished arch, looking up with a sickeningly proud grin as he swung his hammer into the very last load-bearing wooden beam. He genuinely expected the stones to magically hover there, bound together by the sheer force of his inflated ego and a few smooth cuts. The universe, however, is a notoriously harsh critic of bad architecture. The absolute millisecond that the final piece of splintered wood fell away, the massive wedge stones, suddenly realizing they had absolutely nothing to push against in the center, immediately surrendered to the Earth's molten core. Tons of premium, imported Italian marble instantly collapsed straight down, with the deafening roar of a localized earthquake, violently seeking the path of least resistance, which unfortunately happened to be the exact spot where Quintus was currently standing, and admiring his own brilliance. He didn't even have time to drop his hammer before he was instantaneously compacted into a two-dimensional mosaic of regret, learning the hardest and most permanent lesson possible about load-bearing structures. 3. Stealth operations in the ancient world usually required a deep understanding of camouflage, complete silence, the cover of a moonless night, and crucially, not acting like an absolute undeniable moron when planning your infiltration route. This brings us to a heavily muscled, aggressively dense Roman legionnaire stationed on the hostile coast of Carthage, a man whose brain was roughly as smooth and impenetrable as the polished bronze helmet he flat-out refused to take off. His isolated unit was bogged down trying to breach a heavily fortified enemy harbor fort, and morale was dropping faster than a rock in a pond. Wanting to secure eternal glory and probably a massive promotion, our hero pitched a Black Ops mission to his exhausted centurion that sounded like it was ripped straight from a terrible ancient action scroll. His master plan was to utilize the pitch-black, churning ocean to completely bypass the stone walls, swimming silently across the treacherous bay under the cover of darkness. Then, he would emerge from the surf like an angry, dripping god of war, sneak up the unguarded beach, silently eliminate the sentries, and throw open the main wooden gates from the inside for the rest of the waiting army. The centurion, who was likely so sleep-deprived he just wanted this guy to stop talking, casually signed off on the suicide mission and went back to his tent to take a nap. Now, any rational human being preparing for a grueling, miles-long midnight swim in freezing, unpredictable coastal waters would strip down to a simple loincloth, maybe grease their skin to stay warm, and carry absolutely nothing but a small, lightweight iron dagger clamped firmly between their teeth. But our protagonist was a true, uncompromising patriot of the Roman war machine who firmly believed that sacrificing personal protection for mere aquatic mobility was a cowardly insult to the emperor himself. To ensure he was 100% battle-ready the absolute microsecond his toes touched the enemy beach, he decided to gear up for his swimming marathon by strapping on his complete battle-issue Lorica segmentata, a complex, overlapping harness of thick iron strips that weighed upwards of 30 pounds all on its own. Not wanting to feel underdressed for the upcoming slaughter, he also strapped on his heavy leather and metal shin greaves, secured his plumed bronze helmet tightly under his chin, strapped his heavy iron gladius to his waist, and slung his massive, multi-layered wooden and metal scutum shield across his back, just for good measure. He was practically a walking, clanking anvil, possessing a specific gravity that scientists usually reserve for depleted uranium and black holes. His fellow soldiers, watching this bizarre preparation on the docks, hesitantly suggested that maybe wearing 60 pounds of anti-buoyancy equipment into the ocean wasn't the brightest tactical maneuver in military history. He simply laughed at their pathetic lack of faith, slapped his iron chest plate, and proudly announced that the sea would part for a true Roman soldier before confidently marching off the end of the wooden pier into the deep black water. There was no majestic splashing, no heroic strokes against the tide, and absolutely no stealthy swimming involved. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his elite military hardware dragged him straight down the moment he stepped off the ledge, plunging him into the abyss like a human anchor dropped from a galley. His stealth mission was, in a very twisted, highly technical sense, an absolute success, because the Carthaginians never heard him coming, his unit never saw him again, and he managed to completely disappear without a single trace. 4. The Byzantine Empire possessed the ancient world's ultimate weapon of mass destruction, a terrifying nautical superweapon known as Greek fire, and our next historical genius decided it would make an excellent prop for a late-night juggling routine. Imagine a viscous, sticky, unquenchable medieval napalm that was specifically engineered by military alchemists to absolutely obliterate enemy fleets, and you have a basic idea of the liquid nightmare stored in the Empire's highly guarded armories. Enter a spectacularly overconfident sailor named Leonidas, a man who firmly believed he was the undisputed life of the naval party and whose thirst for attention vastly outweighed his basic survival instincts. He was a walking liability who viewed top-secret imperial munitions as his own personal stash of party favors. During a crushingly boring midnight watch on the wooden deck of a heavily armed wardroman, he decided the terrified new recruits needed some entertainment to keep them awake. Bypassing multiple layers of strictly enforced military security, our aggressively dense protagonist managed to casually pilfer a small, sealed clay grenade filled to the brim with the Empire's most dangerous incendiary compound. Now, a quick refresher on Byzantine chemical warfare. The absolute most famously terrifying characteristic of Greek fire was that it could not, under any circumstances, be extinguished with water. In fact, water caused a violent chemical reaction that only made the flames spread faster and burn exponentially hotter, which is exactly why it was exclusively used in naval combat to turn the Mediterranean Sea into a floating barbecue. The only ways to stop the burn were to smother it with copious amounts of sand, or simply wait for it to burn completely through whatever poor soul it was attached to. Completely ignoring the highly visible safety buckets of sand positioned literally 3 feet away from him, Leonidas confidently stepped into the center of the wooden deck and began casually tossing the fragile clay pot of liquid death from hand to hand, boasting about his incredibly fast reflexes. He managed about 3 successful, nerve-wracking tosses before his sweaty palms betrayed his spectacular arrogance. The pot slipped through his fingers, shattering spectacularly on the hard wooden planks and immediately splattering his heavy leather boots and shins with the thick, aggressively combustible green slime. The substance ignited instantly upon contact with the air, turning his lower extremities into a pair of blindingly hot, screaming Roman candles. In a situation that desperately called for the immediate application of sand and dropping to the deck, Leonidas's severely limited brain completely short-circuited. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic and entirely forgetting the one single, defining tactical characteristic of the weapon he was just holding, he instinctively concluded that the absolute fastest way to put out a fire was to jump into a massive body of water. Without a second thought, he vaulted spectacularly over the wooden railing and plunged directly into the dark, salty ocean below, genuinely expecting to hear a satisfying sizzle of relief. Instead, the moment he broke the surface, the water acted like a massive dose of highly explosive lighter fluid. The Greek fire reacted violently to the sea, instantly expanding and enveloping his entire body in a raging, inescapable sphere of aquatic plasma that burned brightly on the surface of the waves. He effectively turned the dark ocean into his own highly visible cremation pyre, thrashing around in a floating inferno of his own making while his horrified crewmates watched from the safety of the ship. Leonidas didn't just fail to extinguish himself. He managed to historically prove exactly why the weapon was so fiercely effective, permanently removing himself from the gene pool. 5. Nothing screams absolute, unhinged prehistoric arrogance quite like looking up at a violently churning, apocalyptic thunderstorm and deciding that you are personally going to fight the sky to prove a political point. We travel back to ancient Celtic Gaul to meet a wildly theatrical, fiercely egotistical tribal druid named Bran, a man who relied on elaborate parlor tricks and aggressive shouting to maintain his iron-fisted spiritual grip over his terrified followers. Bran was facing a massive crisis of faith. A younger, significantly less insane shaman from a neighboring village was starting to steal his congregation. Bran desperately needed a public relations stunt of legendary proportions to re-establish his absolute dominance as the undisputed master of the natural world. He announced to the gathered, shivering masses that he was going to personally summon the storm god, Tyrannus, and physically command the lightning to do his bidding. Now, for anyone possessing even a rudimentary understanding of basic electrical conductivity, standing on top of a hill during a massive atmospheric electrical event is a spectacularly terrible idea. Standing on top of a hill while climbing the tallest, oldest, and most highly exposed oak tree in the entire valley is a localized suicide mission. But Bran was not a man who let the fundamental laws of physics get in the way of a good theatrical performance. As the sky turned a bruising, violent shade of purple and rain began to lash the muddy earth, Bran scurried up the wet, slippery bark of the massive sacred oak, completely ignoring the terrified wails of his tribe below. He finally reached the absolute highest, most perilously thin branch at the apex of the canopy, positioning himself completely exposed against the furious, crackling skyline. This alone would have been enough to earn him a highly competitive spot in the Darwin Awards, but Bran was an overachiever in the field of profound stupidity. To ensure the gods could definitely hear his arrogant, screaming demands, he reached onto his back and unsheathed a massive, 4-foot-long, freshly forged iron broadsword. He proudly thrust the heavy, highly conductive slab of metal straight up into the angry black clouds, essentially transforming his own wet, fleshy body into a perfect, unobstructed grounding wire for millions of volts of raw electrical fury. He threw his head back and screamed a mighty, prideful challenge directly into the heart of the storm, demanding that the thunder god strike his blade to prove his divine mandate. The universe, which absolutely loves a painfully ironic setup, enthusiastically obliged him less than 3 seconds later. A massive, blindingly bright bolt of superheated atmospheric electricity enthusiastically used his raised iron sword as a VIP fastpass directly to the earth. The sheer, overwhelming voltage hit the metal, traveled instantaneously down the blade, through Bran's wildly overconfident nervous system, and blew straight out through his boots into the wet wood of the tree. The deafening, earth-shaking thunderclap knocked the entire audience off their feet, and the blinding flash of the arc vaporized the arrogant druid on a subatomic level before his brain even had the chance to process the concept of pain. When the smoke finally cleared from the splintered, burning top of the oak tree, Bran was spectacularly missing, leaving behind nothing but a pair of smoking, charred boots and a completely melted iron sword permanently welded to a branch, definitively ending his career in atmospheric meteorology. 6. The ancient art of siege warfare was a brutal, grueling, and terrifying ordeal. But for one spectacularly dense defending mercenary, it was apparently just an excellent opportunity to host a medieval roast battle. Meet Kalen, a garrison soldier stationed high on the fortified stone walls of a besieged city, whose absolute love for aggressive, theatrical trash-talking vastly outweighed his understanding of gravity, fluid dynamics, and basic spatial awareness. The enemy army had finally breached the outer defenses and was currently swarming the base of the towering wall, aggressively raising their heavy wooden siege ladders to begin the final, bloody assault. Kalen was assigned what should have been the most idiot-proof, tactically simple job in the entire history of defensive warfare. Stand safely behind the thick stone crenellations, wait for the enemy soldiers to start climbing, and use a heavy iron lever to safely tip a massive, 100-pound iron cauldron of boiling, sticky pitch over the side to ruin their afternoon. But Kalen was a showman, a man who firmly believed that pouring weaponized, superheated tar on an enemy simply lacked the necessary emotional devastation if it wasn't accompanied by a deeply personal, devastating insult about their mothers. He decided that blindly tipping the cauldron from behind the safety of the chest-high stone wall was cowardly and uncinematic. He wanted to look the enemy commander directly in the eyes while he delivered his scalding payload. Completely ignoring the frantic, terrified screaming of his commanding officer, Kalen hoisted the unimaginably heavy, blistering hot iron pot entirely off its pivoting stand. Grunting with the immense effort, he inexplicably stepped up onto the incredibly narrow, rain-slicked stone ledge of the parapet, balancing precariously over a 50-foot drop with a cauldron of bubbling liquid death pressed against his chest. Now, a quick lesson in advanced physics that Kalen desperately needed. 100 pounds of thick, boiling, highly viscous tar sloshing violently around inside a smooth iron bowl creates a wildly unpredictable, constantly shifting center of mass. As Kalen leaned aggressively forward over the sheer drop to deliver his brilliantly crafted, undeniably petty insult to the soldiers below, the heavy liquid inside the cauldron inevitably surged toward the front lip. That sudden, massive shift of 50 pounds of boiling weight forward instantly and violently destroyed Kalen's already fragile center of gravity. He stopped mid-insult, his eyes widening in sudden, terrifying realization as the relentless forces of momentum and gravity took complete and absolute control of his destiny. He tipped past the point of no return, completely unable to pull the massive shifting weight back toward the safety of the wall. In a spectacularly embarrassing display of defensive incompetence, Kalen plummeted directly off his own heavily fortified position, stubbornly clutching the massive iron cauldron to his chest like a dangerously hot safety blanket. He successfully self-marinated in his own weaponized boiling tar on the high-speed 50-foot journey down to the rocky earth below, achieving a level of agonizing destruction that the enemy army couldn't have possibly hoped to inflict. The attacking soldiers at the base of the wall didn't even have to draw their swords. They simply stood back in stunned, bewildered silence and watched as the defending army's primary tactical weapon aggressively delivered itself, permanently silencing the ancient world's most dedicated trash talker. 7. The Persian Empire boasted some of the most terrifying military assets in the ancient world, completely dominating the battlefield with their elite, heavily armored war elephants. These magnificent creatures were essentially the prehistoric, biological equivalent of a main battle tank, weighing upwards of 10,000 pounds and possessing the capability to casually trample entire infantry formations into the dirt. Training these megafauna required incredible caution, deep respect, and a healthy understanding of the fact that you are a squishy meat sack standing next to a living bulldozer. Enter Artabazus, a senior Beastmaster who had unfortunately survived just long enough to develop an utterly delusional, catastrophically inflated sense of his own authority. Artabazus had recently concocted a radically idiotic, entirely untested psychological theory regarding elephant obedience that sounded like it was ripped straight from the worst, most toxic alpha male scroll of antiquity. He firmly believed that physical barriers and sharp training hooks were for cowardly amateurs, loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that he had unlocked the ultimate secret of interspecies communication. His groundbreaking theory dictated that a true, dominant alpha human could effortlessly halt a charging, 5-ton bull elephant simply by standing perfectly still, projecting an aura of absolute superiority, and maintaining unwavering, intense eye contact. He was absolutely convinced that the sheer, overwhelming power of his majestic Persian stare would completely override millions of years of primal animal instinct. Eager to humiliate his skeptical colleagues and secure a massive promotion from the king, Artabazus organized a grand demonstration in the center of the dusty royal training yards. He ordered his assistants to deliberately enrage their largest, most aggressive bull elephant at the far end of the enclosure and then release it directly toward him. As the furious 10,000-pound behemoth let out a terrifying trumpet and began to charge, building up a horrifying amount of kinetic momentum that literally shook the earth beneath their sandals, Artabazus confidently strolled right into the middle of its path. He struck a wildly arrogant pose, crossed his arms over his chest, and locked his eyes onto the rapidly approaching mountain of angry gray muscle, aggressively radiating what he mistakenly thought was pure, unadulterated dominance. Now, if you are wondering how a multi-ton, highly agitated pachyderm interprets a tiny, stationary human aggressively staring at it, the answer is remarkably simple. It doesn't care. It doesn't care even a little bit. The elephant did not experience a sudden psychological breakthrough. It did not recognize his sovereign alpha status, nor did it feel intimidated by his intense, unblinking glare. To the elephant, Artabazus was simply a very squishy, conveniently placed speed bump on the way to freedom. The arrogant Beastmaster held his ground with spectacular, suicidal stubbornness right up until the exact millisecond the elephant's massive, heavily calloused forehead made catastrophic contact with his incredibly fragile ego. Artabazus was instantly and violently flattened into a two-dimensional, highly educational smear in the training yard dirt, definitively proving that while prolonged eye contact might be a great way to win a bar argument, it is a spectacularly terrible strategy for stopping a biological freight train, permanently removing his alpha male genetics from the Persian breeding pool. 8. Ancient Egyptian tombs were notoriously outfitted with some of the most elaborate, merciless, and brilliantly engineered lethal security systems in human history, specifically designed to aggressively punish anyone foolish enough to disturb the resting place of a pharaoh. For thousands of years, these booby traps successfully protected vast fortunes, but they occasionally met their match in the form of incredibly determined, highly experienced tomb raiders. Our protagonist, a spectacularly greedy thief named Nebaman, was actually remarkably good at the breaking-in part of his profession. He had successfully navigated the labyrinthine corridors and miraculously bypassed the triggers of a newly discovered pyramid. However, Nebaman possessed a fatal flaw. His overwhelming, intoxicating greed vastly outweighed his understanding of basic structural mechanics. As he crept into the central burial chamber, his foot brushed against a hidden pressure plate in the limestone floor. A terrifying deep mechanical grinding echoed through the dark room as a massive, 5-ton solid granite slab dislodged from the ceiling directly above him, beginning its agonizingly slow, completely unstoppable descent to crush the intruder into a fine Egyptian paste. Any rational, survival-oriented human being would have immediately executed a frantic combat roll out of the chamber, utterly abandoning the mission to save their own life. But as Nebaman turned to flee, his torch illuminated the glittering, priceless pile of solid gold artifacts resting directly underneath the descending ceiling of doom. In a fraction of a second, his brain performed a phenomenally idiotic risk-benefit analysis. He decided that leaving without the treasure was simply unacceptable, but he needed just a few extra seconds to scoop up the heavy golden idols before the granite ceiling met the stone floor. Looking around frantically, his eyes landed on an old, highly desiccated, completely brittle wooden walking staff left behind by one of the original builders decades ago. In a display of profound, staggering stupidity, Nebaman snatched up the dry, rotting twig and wedged it vertically between the floor and the descending 5-ton granite block. He genuinely, wholeheartedly believed that a single piece of ancient, dehydrated wood could somehow defy the crushing, relentless force of gravity and thousands of pounds of solid rock. Satisfied with his incredibly pathetic, makeshift structural engineering, he confidently crawled directly underneath the massive, hovering slab of certain death to casually start stuffing his linen sack with golden trinkets. He didn't even flinch as the granite made contact with the wooden staff. The universe, holding a rigid adherence to the physical limits of organic material under compression, did not grant him a miracle. The dry wood didn't just bend. It spectacularly, instantly splintered into 1,000 microscopic fragments with a sound like a localized thunderclap. The massive granite ceiling, totally unimpeded by the pathetic twig, immediately resumed its rapid descent, instantly pancaking the greedy tomb raider and his heavy sack of gold. Nebaman successfully achieved his goal of spending eternity surrounded by priceless Egyptian treasure, functioning as a highly permanent, remarkably flat, two-dimensional organic rug for the pharaoh's burial chamber, proving that in a battle between a 5-ton rock and a piece of dry wood, gravity never, ever loses. 9. Spartan culture was globally legendary for producing the most fiercely disciplined, physically intimidating, and relentlessly hardcore warriors of the ancient Mediterranean. Men who were literally bred from birth to endure agonizing pain and conquer impossible odds. However, while their military academies were absolutely phenomenal at teaching hand-to-hand combat and spear tactics, they apparently completely skipped over the fundamental, life-saving principles of buoyancy and water displacement. Enter a spectacularly stubborn, highly intoxicated Spartan hoplite named Brasidas, a man whose aggressive patriotism was currently being fueled by several massive jugs of undiluted, highly potent Greek wine. During a raucous riverside encampment, Brasidas got into a wildly escalating, fiercely macho argument with his fellow soldiers regarding the absolute, unquestionable superiority of Spartan military manufacturing. He loudly proclaimed that Spartan gear wasn't just unmatched in bloody combat, but that it was so divinely perfect in its geometric design that it could literally conquer the elements themselves. To prove his absurdly unhinged point to the laughing crowd, Brasidas decided to make a fatal, alcohol-induced wager. He bet his entire month's share of plunder that he could safely cross the deep, fast-flowing, incredibly treacherous river adjacent to their camp using absolutely nothing but his standard-issue, solid bronze hoplon shield as a personal luxury watercraft. Now, for the uninitiated, a traditional Spartan shield is not a lightweight, buoyant piece of sporting equipment. It is a massive, incredibly dense, 30-pound convex disc forged from solid metal and thick wood, designed specifically to withstand the impact of a charging chariot, not to float like a graceful swan. Completely ignoring the uproarious laughter and the basic reality of metallurgical density, Brasidas confidently dragged his massive shield to the muddy bank of the rushing river. He threw it convex side down into the churning water, genuinely expecting it to bob gently on the surface like an elegantly crafted bronze lily pad. Without a single moment of hesitation, he aggressively stepped out off the muddy bank and planted both of his leather-sandaled feet firmly into the center of the heavy metal dish, striking a majestic, triumphant pose for his audience. He intended to gracefully glide across the water like a heavily armored gondolier. Instead, the universe delivered a brutally fast, highly educational lesson in Archimedes' principle. Because solid bronze displaces absolutely no water relative to its immense concentrated weight, the shield didn't even attempt to float for a fraction of a second. The exact millisecond Brasidas transferred his full, muscular body weight onto the metal disc, it functioned exactly like a perfectly designed, highly efficient nautical anchor. He sank so incredibly fast that he didn't even have time to alter his heroic, victorious facial expression before the dark, freezing water swallowed him whole. The heavy shield dragged him straight down into the murky depths like a stone, pulling the aggressively patriotic, highly intoxicated warrior directly to the muddy bottom of the riverbed. His comrades on the bank immediately stopped laughing as he completely vanished beneath the rapids without a single splash, conclusively ending the debate about Spartan engineering by proving that while their shields were fantastic at stopping Persian arrows, they made absolutely terrible, remarkably lethal heavy metal submarines. 10. The ancient Mediterranean Sea aggressively punished any sailor who lacked a healthy respect for the terrifying power of the open ocean. Unfortunately, the maritime world has always attracted a very specific breed of wildly arrogant adrenaline junkies, and our final historical genius fits that description perfectly. Meet Stavros, a fiercely competitive, aggressively loudmouthed Greek deckhand working on a massive, heavy-hauling merchant galley. Stavros possessed an ego so large it practically needed its own cargo manifest, constantly desperate to prove to the veteran crew that he was the bravest freediver in the entire Aegean fleet. During a routine stop in a particularly deep, incredibly treacherous coastal cove, the captain ordered the crew to drop the ship's primary anchor, a massive, roughly hewn block of solid limestone weighing well over 500 pounds, secured by a thick, heavy woven hemp rope. Seeing a golden opportunity to show off his supposedly legendary aquatic skills, Stavros loudly announced to the exhausted crew that he was going to dive into the water alongside the massive stone anchor and physically race it all the way down to the seafloor just to see who was faster. The older sailors just rolled their eyes and told him he was an idiot, but Stavros was entirely committed to his incredibly stupid bit. However, even Stavros possessed a tiny, fleeting shred of self-preservation. He realized that the underwater currents in the deep cove were famously strong, and he didn't want to get swept away into the open ocean while swimming back up. To solve this problem, he devised what he genuinely believed was a brilliant, foolproof safety mechanism. He grabbed a thick length of spare rigging rope, tied a heavy, incredibly tight knot securely around his own waist, and then aggressively lashed the other end directly to the main anchor chain itself. He proudly explained to his baffled crewmates that this tether would ensure he wouldn't drift away in the current. He completely fatally failed to comprehend the concept of terminal velocity and the sheer, unstoppable kinetic energy of a falling half-ton boulder. The captain, tired of the boasting, gave the order to release the winch. The massive 500-pound stone block plunged off the wooden deck and smashed into the water, immediately beginning its rapid, high-speed plummet into the dark, crushing depths of the abyss. Stavros gave a cocky salute and leaped into the water right behind it, expecting a fun, competitive dive. For about 2 seconds, he was having a great time. Then, the slack on his personal safety rope ran out. The massive stone anchor, accelerating wildly as it sank, violently yanked the tether taut. Stavros was instantly subjected to an inescapable, horrifying downward force that nearly snapped his spine in half. His cocky grin vanished as he was violently dragged down into the freezing black depths at a terrifying, unswimmable speed. He frantically grabbed at the thick knot around his waist, but the immense, relentless tension of a 500-pound stone pulling against his body turned the wet hemp knot into something roughly the density of solid diamond. He couldn't even attempt to loosen it. He was pulled down hundreds of feet in a matter of seconds, acting as an involuntary fleshy tail to a high-speed nautical elevator heading straight to the underworld. Stavros ultimately won the race to the bottom, mostly because he arrived permanently attached to the finish line, definitively proving that tying yourself to a sinking boulder is a spectacularly efficient way to guarantee you never surface again. Alright, be honest. If you were dropped into the Roman Empire tomorrow without your smartphone, which one of these spectacularly stupid mistakes would actually take you out? Don't lie, I know at least 3 of you would try to alpha stare the elephant. Argue about your pathetic historical survival skills in the comments. While you're down there, hit subscribe, and like before, a falling aqueduct gets you.